The mug hit the sink at 7:13 a.m., ceramic against steel, sharp enough to pull me back from wherever my mind had drifted. Water ran cold over my knuckles, steady and relentless. My phone lit up on the counter, screen glowing against the granite, a Slack message from Darius Glenmont, my VP. I wiped my hands slowly on the towel hanging by the stove and picked up the device. I read the message once. Then again, more slowly this time, letting each word settle. Stand down. I'm taking the $1.05 billion win from here. No greeting. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the 16 months I had spent building this deal from concept to closure. Just a command dressed as information, delivered like he was assigning me a new desk instead of erasing my career. My chest tightened, ribs pressing against lungs that suddenly felt too small. But my face stayed still. I had learned years ago that reactions were weapons people used against you. I typed back slowly, deliberately, each letter a small act of control. Received. One word. Nothing else. No questions. No protest. No emotion for him to screenshot and weaponize later. The kettle clicked off behind me, steam curling into the morning light that slanted through the kitchen window. I didn't move to pour it. I stood there, phone in hand, watching the screen dim to black. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, brakes hissing at the stop sign. Inside, something cold and certain settled into place behind my sternum. I knew what this was. I had been preparing for it longer than Darius realized. I arrived at Langford Capital Management 10 minutes early, the way I always did. The lobby smelled like fresh coffee, and the expensive leather chairs no one ever sat in, the kind of furniture that existed purely to signal wealth. I nodded at security, Marcus, who always asked about my weekend, swiped my badge, and took the stairs instead of the elevator. 2 flights up, legs burning slightly, lungs clearing. My hair was neat, pulled back in the low bun I wore for important meetings. My blazer pressed, dark navy with subtle pinstripes. My coffee cup was steady in my hand, lukewarm now but still useful as a prop. No one passing me in the hallway could see the calculations running behind my eyes, the mental checklist I was already working through. When I reached my desk, tucked into the corner office I had earned 3 promotions ago, I opened my inbox. There it was, sitting fourth from the top, a press draft Darius had circulated to senior leadership at 6:47 a.m., long before most people had finished their first coffee. The subject line read, Langford secures historic $1.05 billion capital commitment. I clicked it open and scrolled through the paragraphs, each one more self-congratulatory than the last. My name appeared nowhere. Not in the body text where he described visionary leadership and strategic foresight. Not in the footnotes, where they usually tucked junior contributors and support staff. Not even buried in the acknowledgement section at the end, where they thanked IT for keeping the servers running. He had erased me, as if 16 months of my life had simply never happened. I saved the email to 3 separate folders, each with a different backup protocol, local drive, secure cloud, and an encrypted external server I maintained independently. Then I closed my laptop and smiled at no one in particular. Before my first meeting, I unlocked a folder on my desktop labeled Authorization, Final. It had been sitting there for 3 months, untouched, exactly where I had left it the day the deal structure was finalized in October. Inside were signature authorities, capital release protocols, and a memo from legal clarifying who held final approval power over fund deployment. The document was dense, written in the careful language lawyers use when they want precision without accessibility. But the core message was simple and binding. My name was listed as the managing partner of record for the $1.05 billion tranche. Darius's name appeared only as operational lead, a title that sounded important in meetings but carried no binding authority over actual capital movements. He could coordinate. He could report. He could attend conferences and shake hands with investors. But he couldn't release funds. That power belonged to me, and me alone, unless I chose to delegate it through formal written authorization. Which I never had. I read the document twice, not because I had forgotten its contents, I could have recited key passages from memory, but because I needed to feel its weight again. The heft of legal language. The certainty of documented authority. The protection of structures built carefully over months. Then I closed the folder without changing a single character. Everything I needed was already in place. I had built this structure carefully, quietly, with the kind of foresight people often mistake for luck or paranoia. I stood up, straightened my blazer, checked my reflection in the darkened computer screen, and walked toward the conference room where the morning briefing would begin in 4 minutes. By 9 a.m., the entire leadership team had received Darius's email. The subject line blazed across inboxes like a breaking news headline, proud to have secured the $1.05 billion outcome. He claimed ownership in every line, every paragraph, every carefully constructed sentence. The language was confident, celebratory, final, the tone of someone announcing a victory that could no longer be contested. He wrote about bold vision, strategic courage, and the importance of clear command during high-stakes negotiations. He positioned himself as the sole architect of the deal, the singular mind that had conceived, structured, and delivered an outcome that would define Langford's year. Maybe its decade. I forwarded the message to myself 3 times. Once to my personal email, the address I had maintained since graduate school. Once to a secure cloud archive that required 2-factor authentication and biometric verification. Once to a folder I had labeled simply Timeline, a collection of documents I had been assembling since November. Each copy carried the original timestamp, 6:47 a.m., sent while most of the team was still asleep. Each preserved the sender's name, the recipient list, and the full body text without edits or redactions. I didn't reply. I didn't challenge the narrative. I didn't send a correction to leadership or file a complaint with HR. I didn't raise a single flag that might alert Darius to what I was building. I just preserved. By the time the first executive meeting started at 9:30, I had documentation that could speak louder than any argument I might make in the moment. I sat at my desk, sipping lukewarm coffee that tasted faintly of burnt grounds, and waited for the system to catch up to what I already knew. Darius thought he had one. He was wrong. He had only started a process he didn't understand and couldn't control. The executive stand-up started at 9:30 a.m. sharp, the way it always did. I took a seat in the front row, directly across from the head of the table where Darius stood, hands resting confidently on the back of a chair he hadn't bothered to sit in. He glanced at me once when I entered, a flicker of acknowledgement that lasted less than a second, then looked away. No greeting. No nod. Nothing. He launched into his prepared remarks about market conditions, investor confidence, and the firm's strategic positioning in an increasingly competitive landscape. His voice carried the smooth assurance of someone who believed the room belonged to him, who had never questioned whether his authority was real or simply performed. I waited, hands folded on the table, posture relaxed but attentive. 15 minutes in, he opened the floor for questions. A few people asked about timeline details and regulatory approvals. Someone raised a concern about foreign exchange risk. Darius fielded each question with practiced ease, his answers smooth and confident even when he was clearly improvising. Then I raised my hand. He paused mid-sentence, clearly surprised. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to acknowledge me or continue talking. Finally, he gestured toward me with one hand. Yes, Callista? My voice was calm, almost polite, the tone I used when I wanted to sound cooperative rather than confrontational. Who holds release authority today? The room went silent. Someone shifted in their chair, the leather creaking. Another person set down their pen, the small click amplified by the sudden absence of other sounds. Darius blinked, his smile frozen in place like a mask that had stopped fitting properly. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "The capital release," I clarified, speaking slowly and clearly so there could be no ambiguity. "Who has final authority to approve deployment of the $1.05 billion? Before Darius could deflect further or pivot to another topic, Ilana Veskit from legal leaned forward in her seat. Her tone was measured, professional, carefully stripped of any emotion that might be misinterpreted as taking sides. "The managing partner of record holds final release authority." Every head in the room turned toward me. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But steadily, inevitably, like a tide shifting direction. I didn't smile. I didn't nod in triumph or acknowledgement. I just met their eyes, one by one, and let the silence do the work I had been preparing for months. Darius's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his ear. He tried to regain control quickly, pivoting back to his talking points about strategic momentum, investor relations, and the importance of moving decisively in narrow market windows. But the shift had already happened. People were no longer listening to him with the same unquestioning attention. They were watching me. Wondering. Recalibrating their understanding of who held actual power in this transaction. I folded my hands on the table and waited for the meeting to end. When it did, 20 minutes later, no one spoke to Darius on the way out. But 3 senior directors stopped by my desk within the hour. Each one asked a version of the same question, phrased slightly differently but carrying identical intent. "Are we clear on who's leading this deal? Is there any confusion about authority structure? Do we need to formalize anything in writing?" I told them the same thing every time, my voice calm and factual. "Legal will confirm." And I knew they would. Because I had already ensured they had no choice. At 11:42 a.m., my phone buzzed under the table during a budget review meeting that had dragged on for 30 minutes longer than scheduled. I glanced down, keeping my expression neutral. A text from Darius. "Don't make this messy for yourself." I stared at the message for 3 full seconds, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting the tone or intent. Then I took a screenshot. I did it twice, carefully framing each image to make sure the timestamp, his name, and the full message text were visible in both captures. I saved them to separate locations, one in my phone's secure folder that required fingerprint access, one uploaded immediately to encrypted cloud storage that lived on servers in 3 different countries. I didn't reply. I didn't confront him in the hallway or send a message asking what he meant. I simply documented. Around me, the budget meeting droned on. Someone was debating allocation percentages for a real estate fund that wouldn't close for another 6 months. Another person questioned whether we should increase reserves given market volatility. I half listened, tracking the conversation just enough to nod when appropriate and murmur agreement at the right moments. But my mind was elsewhere, running through sequences and contingencies. I was counting moves like a chess player, thinking 3 steps ahead. Darius had just made his first mistake on record, not just a verbal slip in a meeting that could be denied or recontextualized later, but a written threat sent directly to my phone. And I had preserved it before he could unsend, delete, or claim his account had been compromised. By the time the meeting ended at 12:17, I had everything I needed to establish intent, pattern, and hostility. His words would speak for themselves. At 2:15 p.m., I walked into the quarterly governance review, a meeting most people found tedious, but I had always treated with careful attention. The room was quieter than usual, heavier with an atmosphere I couldn't quite name but recognized instinctively. Darius sat near the head of the table, flipping through notes he clearly hadn't prepared himself. I recognized the formatting from his assistant's work. I took a seat directly across from him and placed a single printed document on the table in front of me. No announcement. No explanation. No attempt to draw attention to what I had just done. Just paper, slightly warm from the printer, resting on polished wood. It was the conduct provision, a clause buried deep in our fund's governing agreements that tied capital deployment to reputational integrity during negotiations. The language was precise and narrow. Any documented behavior that materially undermined trust, structure, or fiduciary relationships allowed for immediate reassessment of authority. I had drafted it myself 6 months ago, working late one evening after everyone else had left the office. Legal had approved it without resistance or significant edits. No one had questioned it at the time because it seemed like standard risk mitigation, the kind of protective language firms included routinely to shield themselves from bad actors and ethical breaches. Now it sat between us, unspoken but visible to anyone who cared to look. Across the table, a compliance officer named Petra glanced at the page, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to read the heading upside down. Her pen stopped moving. Someone else leaned forward, squinting, trying to make out the text. I didn't push. I didn't explain. I didn't gesture toward the document or highlight key passages. I just let it exist, a quiet presence that would draw attention. Halfway through the meeting, my calendar app chimed softly, the notification sound I had set to be noticeable but not disruptive. A pop-up appeared on my laptop screen, visible to anyone sitting close enough. Call with external counsel, 3 p.m. The notification stayed on screen for 5 seconds before I casually reached over and dismissed it with a single click. But that was long enough. More than long enough. The director of risk, Kevin Torrance, glanced at my screen from 2 seats down, his angle just right to catch the text. His expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for someone watching closely to notice. The confidence in his posture softened. His eyebrows drew together. He leaned towards the person beside him, a junior analyst named Fiona, and whispered something I couldn't hear but could easily guess. The conversation in the room continued without interruption. People were still talking about procedural timelines, compliance checkpoints, and the importance of maintaining documentation standards during high-value transactions. But I could feel the secondary conversation happening beneath the official one, spreading like a low electrical current through the room. Someone had noticed. Someone had started connecting dots. After the meeting ended, people filed out slowly, gathering their laptops and coffee cups. Kevin approached me near the coffee station, where I was refilling my mug with water instead of the burnt coffee that had sat in the pot since morning. That call, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. When did you schedule it? I met his eyes directly, holding his gaze with the kind of steady calm that communicated certainty without arrogance. 3 weeks ago. He nodded slowly, his jaw working as he processed the timeline. Then he walked away without another word, his pace slightly faster than usual. He understood. I had been planning this long before Darius made his move. And that changed everything. At 4:47 p.m., after the office had begun to empty and people were packing up for the evening, I submitted a formal governance notice through the firm's internal compliance portal. It was a standard procedural form, the kind filed routinely for high-value transactions that triggered certain regulatory thresholds. The system required no lengthy justification, no detailed narrative explaining my concerns or accusations. Just a simple checkbox indicating that material questions had been raised regarding authority structure and conduct during negotiations. I clicked Submit. The form disappeared into the digital queue, processed instantly by automated systems that didn't care about politics or personalities. A confirmation email arrived in my inbox 30 seconds later, sterile and official. Your governance notice has been received and logged. Reference number, GN 2024-0847. Once filed, the notice triggered an automatic review clock that couldn't be stopped or paused. Compliance had 72 hours to assess the situation and respond with preliminary findings. During that window, no major capital movements could proceed without explicit clearance from the review team. The system was designed specifically to prevent hasty decisions during periods of uncertainty or dispute, to create a mandatory cooling-off period that protected the firm from impulsive actions that might later prove disastrous. It was also completely irreversible. I couldn't withdraw the notice even if I wanted to, even if Darius apologized or promised to restore my role. The clock was ticking now, independent of anyone's wishes or preferences. By the time I logged off for the evening at 5:23 p.m., the mechanism was already in motion. Darius didn't know yet. His calendar had been packed with back-to-back meetings all afternoon, and he probably hadn't checked his compliance notifications. But he would. By tomorrow morning at the latest, the entire compliance team would be reviewing documents, timelines, and communications. And every trail would lead back to the same question: who controlled this deal? The next morning, Darius posted an internal memo to the leadership channel at 8:34 a.m. The subject line read, "Celebrating Leadership Decisiveness in Capital Markets." It was celebratory, self-congratulatory, and deeply, almost impressively tone-deaf given the procedural review that was now active. He wrote at length about bold vision, strategic courage, and the critical importance of clear command during high-stakes negotiations when hesitation can cost millions. He positioned himself explicitly as the sole architect of the $1.05 billion outcome, using phrases like "my strategy," "under my direction," and "the deal I structured." He even included a timeline that conveniently omitted my involvement entirely, as if the 16 months I had spent building relationships with investors and navigating regulatory requirements had simply never occurred. Within 15 minutes of posting, compliance forwarded the memo directly to me with a single line of text attached, "For your review and context. Please retain for records." They were building a file. I understood immediately what was happening. Every communication Darius sent was now being cataloged, time-stamped, cross-referenced, and analyzed against the governance notice I had filed. His words were being preserved as evidence, not celebration. He was creating his own paper trail without realizing it, digging himself deeper with every confident proclamation. I didn't respond to compliance. I didn't need to add commentary or interpretation. The system was doing exactly what I had designed it to do, capturing behavior in real time, preserving intent without distortion, and constructing a timeline that couldn't be rewritten or explained away later. I closed the email and returned to my work, answering routine messages and reviewing quarterly projections. Patience was the strategy now. Let him talk. Let him claim. Let him build the case against himself. At 10:33 a.m., I logged into the governance portal and submitted a second form, this one more significant than the first. It was titled Request for Independent Review, and it invoked a specific clause in our operating agreement that allowed any managing partner to request an external assessment of internal conduct when fiduciary concerns arose. The form was remarkably simple, just 3 fields requiring basic information and a checkbox confirming I understood the implications of my request. It required no additional justification, no detailed explanation of what had prompted my concern. It was designed to be a single button click, embedded in the system precisely for moments like this when internal politics might compromise objective judgment. Once submitted, the request automatically escalated to the board's audit committee, bypassing normal management channels entirely. They were obligated under firm policy to respond within 48 hours and assign an external reviewer, usually a retired partner or independent counsel with no ties to current leadership, within 5 business days. There was no way to block the request. No procedural loophole Darius could exploit. No meeting he could call to reverse the decision. The system accepted my request at 10:34 a.m., processing it instantly. Confirmation emails were automatically generated and sent to the full audit committee, including the chair, Simone Althorpe, a woman I had worked with twice before and respected deeply. By noon, I received a reply from Simone herself, brief and professional, acknowledged. External counsel will be appointed by the end of the week. Thank you for bringing this forward. I saved the email in 3 locations and returned to my desk. Darius still didn't know what was happening. But the walls were closing in systematically, procedurally, irreversibly. The board convened an emergency session at 3 p.m., called with only 2 hours' notice, highly unusual for a body that typically scheduled meetings weeks in advance. I was invited as a standing participant, my name listed at the top of the agenda. Darius was listed as an optional attendee, a subtle downgrade in status that several people would certainly notice and interpret correctly. When I entered the conference room on the executive floor, Simone was already seated at the head of the table, reading through a thick folder of documents with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had been preparing for hours. She gestured for me to sit directly across from her, in the seat normally reserved for senior partners presenting critical matters. Darius arrived 4 minutes late, slightly breathless, his tie loosened and his hair less perfectly arranged than usual. He was holding a leather portfolio, which he kept adjusting nervously, shifting it from one hand to the other. Simone wasted no time on pleasantries or preliminary remarks. "We've received a governance notice and a request for independent review," she said, her voice steady and entirely neutral, conveying neither approval nor disapproval. "I need clarity on the record before we proceed further." She looked directly at me. "Callista, were you sidelined from the capital deployment process?" I kept my tone even, factual, stripped of emotion that might be misread as personal grievance rather than professional concern. "I was documented." The phrase hung in the air, ambiguous enough to avoid direct accusation but specific enough to convey serious intent. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It wasn't a complaint about hurt feelings or wounded pride. It was a factual statement about evidence and records. Simone glanced at the papers in front of her, then back at me. "Can you elaborate?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a printed timeline I had prepared the night before, working until past midnight to ensure every date and detail was accurate. I slid it across the polished table. "Everything is here." The room shifted perceptibly. People leaned forward. Pens started moving again, scratching notes onto legal pads. As the board reviewed my timeline, passing the document around the table and examining it with increasing attention, a second revelation surfaced naturally from the discussion. The $1.05 billion sat in capital accounts I had structured 6 months earlier as part of the original deal architecture, long before anyone anticipated a dispute over authority. They were legally separate from standard operating funds, designed with enhanced governance protections that exceeded normal requirements. The structure was complex, deliberately so, built with input from 3 different law firms to ensure it could withstand regulatory scrutiny and potential challenges. Darius had operational oversight, which sounded important and carried significant status within the firm. It meant he could track the money, generate reports on its status, and communicate with investors about deployment timelines. But he couldn't move it. He couldn't authorize transfers. He couldn't release funds to investment targets or redirect capital to alternative opportunities. Final release authority required dual signatures, mine as managing partner of record, and one board designee rotating quarterly according to a predetermined schedule. His name appeared nowhere in the authorization chain. Nowhere in the signature blocks. Nowhere in the escalation procedures if I was unavailable. Simone read through the account structure documents slowly, her expression hardening with each page she turned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Who established this framework?" she asked, looking up from the papers. "I did," I replied simply. "With full legal approval in November." The documentation was filed with the board at that time. She looked at Darius, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Were you aware of this structure?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face had lost its usual confidence, the smooth certainty replaced by something closer to panic. I assumed operational authority included deployment capability. That's standard in most deals. Assumptions, Simone said quietly, her voice carrying an edge I had rarely heard from her, are not binding agreements. And operational authority has never included capital release in any structure this firm has used. She set the papers down carefully and folded her hands on the table, a gesture that somehow conveyed finality. The silence that followed was absolute. At 4:17 p.m., shortly after the board meeting concluded, Darius sent an email to the full executive committee, 12 senior leaders who shaped firm strategy and made major decisions. The subject line read, "Clarification on recent procedural questions." Inside, he described my role as ceremonial at this stage and suggested that my involvement had been primarily administrative during final negotiations, focused on documentation rather than strategic decision-making. He positioned himself as the lead decision-maker, the person who had closed the deal, while I handled paperwork and coordinating schedules. He implied that any procedural delays or governance questions were unnecessary distractions from market momentum, bureaucratic obstacles that threatened to slow down a deal that needed to move quickly. The email was confident, dismissive, and catastrophically stupid. I saved it immediately, my hand moving to the mouse almost reflexively. Then I forwarded it, without any commentary, without adding my own interpretation or emotional reaction, to Simone, legal, and compliance. Within 20 minutes, I received a response from legal. The associate who handled governance matters wrote simply, "This characterization conflicts with documented authority structures. Filing for formal review of communications." Compliance replied next, equally brief, added to evidence file. "Thank you for flagging this matter." Simone didn't reply at all. She didn't need to. Her silence was more telling than any response could have been. Darius had just created a written record that directly contradicted the legal governance structures the board had approved and filed. It was the kind of mistake that ended careers, the kind of thing that got mentioned years later as a cautionary tale about hubris and carelessness. I closed my laptop and left the office at 5 p.m., earlier than usual. There was nothing more I needed to do today. The system was handling it now, grinding forward with the inexorable logic of bureaucracy. By 6 p.m., well after normal business hours, compliance confirmed a temporary hold on Darius's operational authority pending the outcome of the independent review. The email was sent to him first, copied to senior leadership as a courtesy, and filed in the official governance record where it would remain permanently. It was framed as a routine protective measure, the kind of thing firms did regularly to avoid liability during unclear periods. The language was careful, almost apologetic, in the interest of clarity and to protect all parties during the review process. But everyone who received it understood what it really meant. Darius had been sidelined. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would create embarrassing headlines or worried calls from investors. Just procedurally. Quietly. Effectively. He couldn't approve transactions. He couldn't release statements on behalf of the firm. He couldn't act in any binding capacity or make commitments that would obligate Langford Capital. His authority had been suspended, placed in a kind of professional suspended animation while the review proceeded. And he didn't know yet. The email wouldn't arrive in his inbox until after 6 p.m., after he had likely left the office for a dinner meeting or evening event. By the time he read it, possibly on his phone while sitting in a restaurant or driving home, the decision would already be filed, time-stamped, logged in multiple systems, and irreversible through normal channels. I sat at home that evening, tea cooling on the table beside me, and waited. My phone stayed silent. No calls. No frantic messages demanding explanation or threatening retaliation. Just the quiet hum of a plan unfolding exactly as I had designed it, each piece falling into place with satisfying precision. The next morning, I filed a formal invocation of the conduct clause. It was a single-page document, surprisingly brief given its significance, citing material undermining of negotiations and governance structures and requesting immediate reassessment of authority assignments. The language was precise, borrowed directly from the clause itself to avoid any ambiguity about what I was invoking. The system accepted it at 8:02 a.m. when I clicked submit. Confirmation arrived 30 seconds later. Your request has been logged and forwarded to the governance review team. By 8:15 a.m., legal called me directly. Not an email. Not a meeting request. A phone call, which indicated urgency. We need to discuss next steps, the senior associate said, her voice professional but carrying an undertone of concern. I'm available now, I replied, already gathering my laptop and the folder of documents I had prepared. We met in a small conference room on the 4th floor at 9 a.m. sharp. 2 attorneys, 1 compliance officer, and me. The room was windowless and quiet, insulated from the normal office noise. They asked careful questions, specific, clearly following a checklist someone had prepared. I answered with documentation. Every claim I made was backed by an email, a memo, a signed agreement, or a time-stamped record. I had brought copies of everything, organized chronologically in a binder with color-coded tabs. By 10 a.m., they had everything they needed spread across the conference table. This is actionable, the senior attorney said, looking at her colleague for confirmation. He nodded. We'll escalate immediately to the review team and the board's legal committee. I thanked them and returned to my desk. The rest was out of my hands now, transferred to processes and procedures that would unfold according to their own logic. The system would do what it was designed to do, protect the integrity of the deal and enforce accountability when violations occurred. I had simply given it the evidence it needed to act. At 11:23 a.m., my phone rang. Darius's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, taking a breath to center myself. Callista, he said, his voice tight and strained in a way I had never heard before. We need to talk. Now. About what? I asked, keeping my tone neutral and mildly curious. You know what? This compliance review. These procedural holds. You need to stand down immediately. This is getting out of hand. I'm not sure what you're referring to, I said, which was technically true. I wasn't sure which specific aspect of the situation was bothering him most. Don't play games with me, he snapped, his voice rising. You're undermining the firm. You're putting the entire deal at risk with these bureaucratic delays. Investors are going to start asking questions. I'm protecting it, I said quietly, letting the words hang. He went silent for a moment. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him pacing in his office or standing by his window. Then his voice came back, harder and more aggressive. This is insubordination. Direct insubordination. I'm recommending your removal from the transaction team immediately. This conversation is over. That's your choice, I replied calmly. But I'd speak with legal first before making that recommendation official. I hung up before he could respond. Then I checked my voicemail. He had left one before calling, apparently assuming I wouldn't answer. I listened to it once, saved it to 3 locations, and forwarded it to the board, compliance, and the external review team that had been appointed the day before. I didn't add any commentary. I didn't need to provide context or interpretation. His words spoke for themselves, threatening, aggressive, retaliatory. Within an hour, I received a message from Simone. Noted. Thank you for keeping us informed. By early afternoon, the risk management team completed their preliminary analysis and flagged Darius's communications as potential reputational exposure. His emails, his public memo, his phone call to me, all of it was cataloged, cross-referenced, and analyzed against the firm's conduct standards and regulatory requirements. The review found multiple inconsistencies between his public claims and documented governance structures. It also identified language that could expose the firm to liability if investors questioned authority during negotiations or if regulatory bodies decided to investigate the deal's approval process. My communications, by contrast, were clean. Every email I had sent was measured, factual, and supported by reference documentation. I had preserved evidence without editorializing or adding emotional commentary. I had followed protocol without unnecessary escalation. I had documented problems without creating new ones. The risk report, which I only saw a summary of later, concluded that my actions had protected fiduciary integrity and maintained clear governance structures, while Darius's had introduced material uncertainty and potential reputational harm to the firm. The report was submitted to the board at 3:47 p.m. I didn't see the full document until weeks later, but I knew what it would say. I had been careful. Darius had been careless. And in high-stakes capital markets where reputation and trust formed the foundation of every transaction, carelessness was unforgivable. By late afternoon, banks began calling. Not with accusations. Not with panic or demands for immediate explanation. Just neutral, carefully worded questions about governance clarity and timeline certainty. They wanted to know who they should be speaking with regarding final approvals. Which name should appear on transfer authorizations? Who had the actual power to say yes when deployment decisions needed to be made? I didn't initiate any of these calls. I didn't leak information to create pressure or plant doubts in investors' minds. But the questions came anyway, naturally, inevitably. Markets are extraordinarily sensitive to uncertainty, and Darius's behavior had introduced just enough noise, just enough ambiguity about who actually controlled the transaction, to raise flags among people whose entire careers depended on reading subtle signals correctly. One senior banker, someone I had worked with on 3 previous deals, asked me directly, "Callista, are you still leading this transaction on the ground level?" "Yes," I replied simply. "Has anything changed on the authority side?" "We're getting some mixed signals from different people." "No," I said. "The structure remains exactly as documented. We're proceeding as originally agreed." The banker paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "Good. That's good." We were getting a bit confused by some communications from Darius, but I'm glad to have direct confirmation from you. By the end of the day, 3 separate institutions had reached out with similar questions, each conversation following roughly the same pattern. Each time, I gave the same answer, calm, clear, consistent, and entirely factual. The pressure on Darius was mounting from external sources now, not just internal review processes. And he still didn't realize how much of that pressure was his own doing. At 7:14 a.m. the following morning, legal issued a formal clarification to senior leadership. The memo was marked urgent, governance clarification, and sent to everyone on the executive committee, plus the full board. It stated, in explicit and legally binding terms, that final capital release authority flowed through my authorization path as managing partner of record. Darius's role was confirmed as operational coordination only important for day-to-day management but carrying no binding authority over fund deployment. The memo included detailed references to governing agreements, account structures established in November, and board resolutions dating back 6 months that had approved the framework I had designed. It cited specific sections and page numbers, leaving no room for interpretation or dispute. It was definitive. It was binding. And it was copied not just internally but also to the external review team, the audit committee, and all key stakeholders, including the primary banking partners. I read it once at my desk, saved it to my permanent files, and closed my laptop. By mid-morning, I received a call from Simone. Her voice was warmer than usual, less formal. "Callista," she said, "I want to be very clear with you. The board is fully confident in your leadership on this transaction." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my response simple. We're moving forward with the independent review as planned, that's just proper procedure at this point. But your authority is not in question. That's been firmly established. I exhaled slowly, allowing myself a moment of relief I hadn't fully realized I needed. Understood. Darius is another matter, she added, her tone cooling slightly. We'll be addressing that situation separately in the coming days. The call ended. I sat at my desk, staring at the wall of my office, and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in days, relief mixed with vindication. At 5:02 a.m. the next morning, while I was still sleeping, a legal trigger activated automatically. It was part of the account structure I had built months earlier, a failsafe designed specifically to protect capital during governance disputes or leadership transitions. The logic was simple: if operational authority was formally contested or suspended through official channels, control automatically reverted to the managing partner of record after a 72-hour review period. The clock had started when compliance placed Darius on administrative hold 3 days earlier. Now, precisely 72 hours later, the system executed its programmed response. I received an automated notification on my phone at 5:03 a.m. The buzz woke me, pulling me from sleep. I squinted at the screen, reading the message twice to make sure I understood. The $1.05 billion tranche was now under my exclusive control. No dual signature required. No board approval needed for routine deployment decisions. Just me. The transition happened silently, without press releases or public statements or dramatic announcements. Only legal and compliance were automatically notified through the system. No humans made the decision, it was entirely algorithmic, triggered by predetermined conditions being met. By the time I arrived at the office at 8:30 a.m., showered and dressed and carrying my usual coffee, the shift was already complete and logged in multiple systems. Darius no longer had access to transaction records. His name had been systematically removed from distribution lists, portal access, and stakeholder communications. He was functionally locked out of his own deal. And I held all the keys, every single one, with full legal authority and board backing. At 9 a.m., the board convened an emergency session. Darius was not invited. The agenda was brief and direct: resolution of governance dispute and interim leadership structure. Simone opened the meeting with a direct statement, her voice carrying the weight of formal board action. Based on the findings of the independent review, the analysis from legal and compliance, and the documented evidence of conduct violations, we are placing Darius Glenmont on administrative leave effective immediately pending further findings and potential disciplinary action. She paused, letting that announcement settle before continuing. Callista Renford will assume full leadership of the $1.05 billion transaction, effective immediately, with complete authority over all aspects of deal structure, deployment, and stakeholder management. There were no objections. No debate. No questions about whether this was the right decision or if we were moving too quickly. Just nods around the table and murmurs of agreement. The decision was unanimous, recorded in the minutes, and legally binding. When the meeting ended 15 minutes later, Simone approached me privately near the door as others filed out. "You handled this with remarkable precision," she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine respect. "Most people would have escalated emotionally, made threats, created drama. You didn't. You built a case methodically and let the process work." "I couldn't afford to do otherwise," I replied honestly. She nodded slowly, studying my face. "That's exactly why you're still standing. And why he's not." I left the room and returned to my desk. My title hadn't changed on my business cards. My office location hadn't moved to a higher floor. My salary hadn't increased yet, though I suspected that conversation would come later. But the power structure had shifted completely and irreversibly. And everyone in the building knew it. Within 24 hours, I rerouted the transaction through a modified compliance structure I had already prepared during the previous week, working late into the evenings to ensure every detail was correct. It was a refined deployment plan that addressed the procedural gaps and reputational risks Darius's behavior had exposed, incorporating feedback from legal and adding additional oversight mechanisms that would satisfy even the most cautious board members. I coordinated carefully with legal, compliance, and the external review team to ensure every step met fiduciary standards and regulatory requirements. I held individual calls with each major stakeholder, explaining the governance changes clearly and honestly without disparaging Darius or creating unnecessary drama. Partners who had been hesitant during the period of uncertainty, who had delayed decisions while waiting to see how the power struggle resolved, now followed my lead without question or resistance. Investors received clear, consistent communication that emphasized continuity and stability. Banks confirmed their confidence in the transaction and their comfort with the governance structure. The deal, which had been teetering on the edge of collapse under the weight of reputational risk and internal conflict, stabilized completely within 48 hours. By the end of the week, all stakeholders had signed off on the revised structure. The $1.05 billion was secure, protected, and moving forward cleanly toward deployment. Darius's name appeared nowhere in the final documentation. He had been systematically erased from the narrative he had tried so desperately to claim as his own achievement. And I had done it without raising my voice once, without making threats, without creating scenes. Just process, documentation, and patience. 3 days after Darius was removed from the transaction, the $1.05 billion deal closed officially. My signature appeared at the bottom of the final authorization document, witnessed by legal counsel and countersigned by the board's designee. No drama. No headlines in the financial press. No celebratory announcements or victory laps. Just quiet, professional execution. I stood in my kitchen that evening, the same sink where the mug had clinked against steel days earlier when Darius's message first arrived. Water ran cold over my hands as I rinsed my dinner dishes. I dried them slowly, deliberately, the familiar motions grounding me after an exhausting week. On the shelf above the counter, I had placed a small, framed screenshot in a simple black frame. It was the text message Darius had sent me, "Don't make this messy for yourself." I looked at it now, the words frozen in time, preserved as evidence of the moment he had fundamentally underestimated who I was and what I could build. I didn't smile at it. I didn't celebrate or feel triumphant. I just stood there, dish towel in hand, steady and certain, the way I had been all along, patient, methodical, prepared. He had tried to move me aside with a single message, expecting me to accept defeat quietly. Instead, his attempt to sideline me had moved me forward into a position of complete authority. And I had made certain that no one involved would ever forget the difference between performing power and holding it.